The board votes in 10 minutes. Ms. Vale, marry, or lose everything. The words landed hard across the glass conference room, while the city glowed cold behind Evelyn Vale's reflection. 30 floors of blue light and rain-slicked traffic trembling under the windows. The air smelled faintly of espresso and printer heat. A red digital clock on the wall clicked forward with cruel precision, each second sounding louder than the last. Evelyn did not sit. Her black heels stayed planted on the charcoal carpet, shoulders square, one hand pressed against the back of a leather chair until her knuckles went pale. Around the table, the men who had built careers under her father's name avoided her eyes and studied their folders instead. One of them, Charles Mercer, folded his gold pen and spoke like he was offering mercy. The market is already nervous. Your breakup with Senator Hawthorne became a headline. The activist fund smells blood. We need stability, family optics, a legal spouse with no corporate baggage. Another board member cleared his throat. A marriage resets the narrative before tomorrow's earnings call. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she gave them nothing else. The overhead lights hummed softly. Ice shifted in a forgotten water glass. She looked from one face to another and saw the same thing in every careful expression. They were not asking. They were cornering her with polished language and perfect timing. "You want a husband," she said, her voice flat as polished steel. "No," Mercer replied, smoothing his cuff. "We want a shield." 2 security staff stood near the door, not touching it, just present enough to make the room feel smaller. In front of Evelyn sat a thin cream folder embossed with the company seal. She opened it. Inside was a post-nuptial public image plan, a list of approved candidates, and at the bottom, a clause she recognized from the emergency governance bylaws. If the CEO's conduct posed a material threat to investor confidence, interim authority could be reassigned by board vote. Her thumb paused over the page. The paper was heavy, expensive, almost soft. It still felt like a trap. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Mercer did not blink. At 4 p.m., the board removes you as acting chair. By 4:15, the press release goes out. Silence stretched for one breath too long. Somewhere beyond the glass, a siren wailed and faded. Evelyn closed the folder, then turned toward the window. Her reflection looked composed, but the pulse at her throat beat fast under the clean white collar of her blouse. Vale Dynamics was her father's name on steel, satellites, medical patents, freight contracts. It was also the one thing in her life she had dragged, year after year, away from men who mistook control for competence. Now the same kind of men were offering her a ceremony like a noose wrapped in silk. "You have until the vote," Mercer said. "Choose someone suitable, someone quiet, someone grateful." Evelyn turned back slowly. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Grateful men are usually the most dangerous," she said. Then she took the folder, walked out into the bright hallway smelling of lemon polish and cold air conditioning, and did not slow until she reached the private elevator. Her assistant was waiting there, tablet in hand, eyes wide. "They already sent over the shortlist," the woman whispered. Evelyn scanned the names. Heirs, attorneys, political sons, men polished enough to stand beside her and weak enough to be controlled by the board. Then, at the very end, almost hidden like a clerical joke, there was one name with no pedigree attached. Daniel Brooks, widower status unknown, guardian of one minor child, freelance facilities contractor, annual income modest, no known affiliations, clean record. Evelyn stared at it for a beat as the elevator doors slid open with a hush of steel. A strange stillness touched the moment. She stepped inside, the folder at her side, and said the one thing that made her assistant stop breathing for half a second. "Find Daniel Brooks before they do." By the time Evelyn's car turned off the avenue, the glass towers had thinned into older brick, flickering laundromat signs, and narrow storefronts washed in the amber glow of late afternoon. The tires hissed over wet pavement. A delivery truck rattled past, leaving behind the smell of diesel and hot pretzels from a corner cart. On her lap sat the same cream folder, now creased at one corner from her grip. Her assistant sat across from her in the town car's rear jump seat, reading from a tablet in a low voice. Daniel Brooks, 38, independent contractor. Mostly repairs commercial ventilation, emergency systems, light structural work. One son. No debt flags, no lawsuits, no scandal. He picks up work all over the city. Evelyn looked through the window at a row of walk-up buildings with rusted fire escapes and flower boxes struggling through October. Who added him to my list? She asked. No clear origin, the assistant said. The request came through legal review, not the board office. The answer only sharpened the quiet around Evelyn. She had spent years learning how power announced itself. This did not feel like power. It felt like something tucked deliberately in plain sight. The car stopped in front of a small neighborhood diner with steamed-up windows and a neon open sign that buzzed faintly against the dusk. Through the glass, she saw him before she stepped out. Daniel Brooks was kneeling beside a booth with a toolbox open at his feet, one sleeve rolled to his forearm, tightening a loose panel beneath a seat, while a little boy sat cross-legged nearby, doing homework with a stubby pencil. The boy's sneakers swung an inch above the floor. Daniel said something without looking up, and the child grinned, pushed his workbook toward him, and waited while his father checked a math answer with a grease-marked thumb. No performance, no self-pity, just practiced rhythm. The bell above the diner door gave a thin metallic ring when Evelyn entered. Warm air wrapped around her, carrying coffee, butter, and the faint bite of bleach from a recently mopped tile floor. Several heads turned. Her wool coat, sharp lines, and city polish did not belong there. Daniel rose slowly when the owner pointed her out, wiping his hands on a clean rag before offering one. His palm was rough, steady, cool from the draft near the door. Daniel Brooks, he said. You're looking for the owner, not me, unless your heat went out. Evelyn did not smile. I'm looking for you. The little boy glanced between them with open curiosity. Daniel noticed that, then reached for the workbook and closed it gently. Owen, he said, grab your jacket. The child obeyed without protest, the zipper teeth clicking in the quiet. Daniel led them outside to the narrow sidewalk, where the evening air had turned sharper and a bus exhaled at the curb in a cloud of warm vapor. You have 2 minutes, he said. Evelyn had negotiated with senators, hedge funds, and men who considered silence a weapon. Somehow his plain tone was harder to cut through than any of theirs. I need a husband, she said. A taxi horn barked down the block. Owen's eyes widened, then lifted to his father's face. Daniel did not move. That's not a line people usually open with, he said. Evelyn took the folder from under her arm and held it out. It's legal, public, and temporary. My board wants a marriage before tonight's vote. You fit the requirements, and I need someone outside their control. Daniel did not touch the folder. He watched her instead, his expression unreadable in the neon spill from the diner window. And what, he asked, would my son be stepping into? The question landed harder than any objection she expected. For the first time that day, Evelyn looked at the child standing in a too-big puffer jacket, one small hand curled around his father's sleeve, and understood this was not a transaction she could command into place. She crouched, her coat brushing the damp sidewalk, and met Owen at eye level. A mess, she said, but not one I'd let touch him. Daniel's gaze shifted, just slightly. Then he finally took the folder, opened it under the street lamp, and read in silence while traffic murmured and rainwater dripped from an awning edge in slow, cold ticks. When he reached the last page, he closed it with care. If I do this, he said, there will be rules. Rain tapped the diner awning in thin, metallic ticks while the street lamp threw a pale gold circle across the wet sidewalk. Steam from the kitchen vent drifted low and warm, carrying the smell of coffee and frying onions into the cold night. Daniel held the folder against one palm and looked past the pages toward the Blacktown car idling at the curb, its engine humming softly under the rain. Evelyn straightened, one hand closing the collar of her coat against the wind. Owen stood close to Daniel's leg, sneaker toe tracing a line through a puddle. Rules, Evelyn said, her voice even. Say them. Daniel crouched so his son did not have to tilt his head. He brushed a damp curl from Owen's forehead, then rose with the same unhurried control he had used when he read every clause. He stays with me, Daniel said. No boarding schools, no surprise appearances in front of cameras. No one uses my son to polish a stock price. Traffic hissed behind them. A neon open sign buzzed in the diner window. Evelyn's jaw tightened once, then she gave a small nod. Done. Second, Daniel said, tapping the folder. If your board thinks this buys a puppet, they will learn otherwise. I won't be managed by strangers. Her eyes narrowed, not with outrage now, but calculation. That might be the first useful thing anyone said to me all week. He continued as if she had not spoken. Third, there will be one home base. Owen keeps his school, his routine, his room. If this arrangement pulls him through lobbies and headlines every day, it ends. The boy looked up at Evelyn. Do you have loud hallways? He asked. For the first time since stepping out of the car, she almost smiled. Yes, she said. Too many. Daniel closed the folder and handed it back, but not before sliding one page free. He folded that page once and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then the contract gets rewritten. A gust carried the smell of rain-soaked concrete and diesel from the avenue. Evelyn studied him in the sodium light, then turned to her driver. Take us to my attorney. The drive downtown passed in a silence broken only by wiper blades and the faint rattle of Owen's dinosaur toy against the leather seat. Glass towers rose out of the mist, silver and cold. On the 32nd floor of a law office that smelled of toner, cedar polish, and stale espresso, Evelyn's attorney began objecting before his chair had fully stopped rolling. This is not how these agreements are structured. Daniel set his hand on the marked-up document and spoke without lifting his voice. Then structure it again. The attorney glanced to Evelyn for rescue. None came. Instead, she took off her gloves finger by finger and laid them beside the folder. He stays in his school. No publicity involving the child. Separate financial protection for Owen. Mutual exit terms if the board breaches confidentiality. The attorney blinked. You're conceding leverage. No, she said, looking directly at Daniel. I'm correcting bad assumptions. Hours later, ink dried under white recessed lights while the city beyond the glass looked hard and sleepless. Daniel signed only after reading the final page twice. Evelyn signed faster, but her pen paused when she reached the line that changed her legal residence. The paper made a dry scratching sound in the quiet room. By dawn, a private clerk had stamped the license, and the marriage existed in the eyes of the law before the board could recast it. The ceremony itself happened in a judge's narrow chamber with beige walls, humming vents, and a flag that leaned slightly to one side. Owen sat in a chair too big for him and swung his feet 6 inches above the carpet while Evelyn answered each question with clipped precision. Daniel's voice was low and steady when his turn came. No rings, no guests, just signatures, a witness, and the soft thump of a seal pressed onto paper. Outside the courthouse, camera flashes burst from across the street like white sparks in fog. Someone had been tipped off. Evelyn stopped cold. Daniel moved before her security did, turning his body to block the clearest angle and guiding Owen behind him with one hand. Car, he said. She obeyed without argument. Inside the back seat, breath clouded the window for a second before the heater caught up. Evelyn looked at the courthouse papers in her lap, then at the man beside her whose coat still smelled faintly of rain and sawdust. You just married into a storm, she said. Daniel watched the photographers shrink behind them in the gray morning. No, he said. I'm married into a countdown. The elevator doors opened on a hush of polished steel and recirculated air, and the penthouse foyer answered with too much space, too much glass, too little warmth. Rain still streaked the windows in silver lines, and the marble floor held the last of the city's cold like a slab of winter underfoot. Owen stepped in first, backpack slipping off one shoulder, his sneakers making small rubber sounds across stone. He stopped at the sight of the living room. Cream furniture untouched, a piano closed like a secret, skyline lights drifting in the dark glass, and looked back at Daniel instead of at Evelyn. Daniel took in the room once, then set their overnight duffel on a console table with a quiet thud. Evelyn handed a keycard to the house manager waiting by the hallway. No press, no staff access to the West guest wing, and nothing about the child leaves this floor. The woman nodded and disappeared. Daniel noticed the security camera angled toward the main corridor before he noticed the flowers. White orchids, fresh cut, expensive, arranged beneath a note in silver ink from the board congratulating the happy couple. He lifted the card, read it, and set it face down. They got ahead of the story, Evelyn said. They always do. Then take something back, Daniel replied. He crossed to the camera, reached up, and turned its lens an inch toward the ceiling. Not broken, not dramatic. Just enough to deny anyone a clear line into Owen's temporary room. The small move changed the air. Evelyn watched it happen, then pressed her thumb to a wall panel, and killed interior recording on the private floor. Better? She asked. For tonight, Daniel said. The boy wandered to the glass and breathed a foggy circle onto it. 34 stories below, headlights slid like beads through the rain. Do people live this high on purpose? He asked. Some do, Evelyn said, placing her phone face down at last. I don't recommend it before age 10. Daniel unpacked with a contractor's efficiency, not a guest's caution. Toothbrush by the sink. Owen's pajama shirt folded on a chair. Prescription inhaler in the top drawer where small hands could still reach it. That detail caught Evelyn's eye. She said nothing, but she opened a closet and pulled out an extra wool blanket herself instead of calling someone to do it. Morning came thin and gray. Coffee filled the kitchen with a dark, bitter warmth while the city rattled beyond the glass. Evelyn stood at the island in a charcoal suit, scanning a tablet full of red notifications. The board had scheduled an emergency optics call at 9. Markets were opening in under an hour. Her espresso sat untouched, cooling in a white cup. Daniel glanced once at the scrolling headlines on her screen: speculation, anonymous sourcing, questions about the speed of the marriage, and then at the lunchbox he was packing for Owen. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, napkin folded in half. You're not sending him to school today, Evelyn said. With cameras outside? No. Routine matters, Daniel answered. Fear shouldn't set his calendar on day 1. This isn't fear. It's containment. He capped the juice bottle and set it beside the lunchbox. Call the school. Have them use the underground pickup entrance. Short-term security, normal day. She looked up sharply. You think they'll just take instructions from me before sunrise? No, Daniel said, wiping a crumb from the counter with the side of his hand. They'll take them if you sound like someone protecting a child instead of managing a headline. The words landed cleaner than an insult and harder than one. A beat later, her phone buzzed with her chief legal officer's name. Daniel saw the shift in her posture when she answered. Not panic. Worse. Stillness. Say that again, she said into the phone. The kitchen's under-cabinet lights threw a pale line across the marble. Owen sat at the far end of the island, coloring silently, red markers squeaking over paper. Evelyn listened, then lowered the phone by an inch. The board moved up the vote, she said. Noon. They're using the media leak to claim impaired judgment. Daniel slid Owen's lunchbox closed, the plastic latch snapping into place. Then he reached for Evelyn's cold espresso, pushed it gently aside, and turned the tablet toward himself for the first time. His eyes moved across names, timestamps, market notes, and one internal memo highlighted in yellow. When he spoke, his voice stayed low enough that Owen never looked up. They didn't just leak the marriage, Daniel said. They timed the leak to your board packet. Evelyn stepped closer. How do you know that? He tapped the memo once with his finger. Because this note was circulated 7 minutes before the first photo hit the wire, which means someone inside wanted the stock reaction before the directors got context. The city hummed. The refrigerator motor clicked on. Evelyn stared at the screen, then at him, and for the first time since the courthouse, the room no longer felt divided into her world and his. The call starts in 40 minutes, she said. Daniel picked up the tablet and handed it back. Then in 40 minutes, he said, they find out you didn't marry a bystander. Rain tapped softly against 40-story glass, and the blue-white glow of 3 muted news screens painted the penthouse kitchen in cold strips of light. Somewhere below, horns floated up from the avenue, thin and restless, while the smell of dark coffee and toasted bread lingered over stone counters that suddenly felt more like a war room than a home. Evelyn stood at the island with her phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other as the emergency board call snapped to life on the tablet. Daniel pulled out a chair for Owen, slid a plate of cut strawberries toward him, and said, "Headphones on, buddy." The boy obeyed, small fingers reaching for the bright red slices while camera shutters popped faintly from the street outside like dry twigs breaking in the dark. Then Charles Mercer's voice came through the speaker, smooth as polished brass. Before noon, he said, the market deserves certainty. So do our investors. Evelyn did not sit. The silk sleeve at her wrist brushed the granite as she leaned closer and said, "You moved the vote without my consent." "We acted for the company," Charles replied. Another director joined in. Then another. 3 clipped voices, 3 rehearsed concerns, 3 men hiding behind governance while trying to pry the wheel from her hands. The air conditioner hummed overhead. Ice melted in a neglected glass of water. Daniel said nothing at first. He only watched the board packet on Evelyn's screen, his thumb resting along the edge of the table like a man counting beats no one else could hear. Charles shifted tactics. The marriage has already triggered noise, he said. A contractor husband, a child in the residence, press speculation about instability. We need an interim executive structure by noon. The room went still enough for Owen's spoon to click softly against ceramic. Evelyn lifted her chin, but before she could answer, a new alert flashed across every screen. Veil Dynamics stock down 8%. A grainy photo from the courthouse. A headline about a desperate marriage. Another alert landed behind it, then another. Internal emails leaked. Anonymous quotes from senior staff. A claim that lenders were reconsidering exposure. The attack was no longer contained. It was coordinated, public, and moving faster than her legal team. She called her chief communications officer. Straight to voicemail. She called the general counsel. Declined. The silence on those lines was louder than any accusation on the screens. Daniel reached for the tablet. Put it on speaker, he said quietly. Charles laughed under his breath. And now the husband advises governance. Daniel's gaze never rose to the camera. No, he said. Now the man you misjudged explains what you did wrong. The refrigerator motor clicked off. Even the city seemed to hold still. Daniel asked one question after another. Not fast, not emotional, just clean and exact. Who authorized investor outreach before the board packet was finalized? Who approved the external media statement draft at 6:12 a.m.? Who had access to the revised debt covenant schedule that leaked 30 minutes later? Names came slowly. Then one name came twice. Then 3 times. Evelyn turned her head. Her knuckles whitened around the phone. Charles cut in sharply, but too late. Daniel had already pinned the pattern to one person in the room and one person outside it. A board loyalist on the finance committee and a rival acquisition firm waiting for panic to cheapen the company. You don't have proof, Charles snapped. Daniel finally looked toward the screen. You don't have control, he answered. Evelyn moved before anyone told her to. She opened the executive access panel on her phone, revoked the finance committee members' credentials, froze outgoing data permissions, and sent a direct emergency order to building security and IT. Within seconds, a message came back from headquarters. Badge disabled, workstation locked, counsel notified. One of the directors cursed under his breath. Another dropped from the call. A third tried to adjourn the meeting. No, Evelyn said, her voice low and flat as cut steel. No one leaves this call. Charles tried one last time. He said the lenders would force her out by lunch. He said the market had already chosen. He said she was finished. Daniel picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, the worn canvas brushing softly against the wood, and checked the time. Then we stopped doing this through screens, he said. Evelyn looked at him. He did not ask permission, and he did not offer comfort. He only offered direction. Get dressed, he said. We're going to your headquarters, and before noon, your enemies are going to learn they pushed too far. Leather seats carried the faint smell of cedar and rain as the town car cut through downtown traffic, wipers beating a steady rhythm across the windshield while camera flashes chased them at stoplights. A siren wailed somewhere 3 blocks away, swallowed by the glass canyon of Midtown, and the skyline ahead looked hard and silver under a low ceiling of cloud. Daniel sat beside Owen in the back, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, while Evelyn worked 2 phones at once and watched her company's stock crawl red across the smaller screen. By the time they reached Veil Dynamics headquarters, a crowd had thickened behind barricades. Reporters shouted questions. Security badges buzzed at the lobby gates. The revolving doors spun too fast, then stalled, then spun again as executives tried to leave before being seen. Evelyn stepped out first in a charcoal coat and heels that struck the wet stone with sharp, precise clicks. For half a breath, several staffers looked relieved to see her. Then they saw Daniel carrying Owen's backpack over one shoulder, plain jacket damp at the collar, and the relief curdled into confusion. Inside, the lobby smelled of polished marble and burnt espresso from a kiosk no one had bothered to close. Phones vibrated in every hand. Television anchors murmured from screens mounted above the reception desk. The acting communications deputy rushed toward Evelyn with a stack of printouts and a face gone pale under fluorescent light. 2 lenders had requested emergency clarification. A A supplier had paused a shipment. A senior vice president was unavailable. Daniel took in the room once, then said, "Where's your crisis team meeting?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. 42nd floor. He nodded toward Owen. "He stays with you, or we leave." It was not a threat dressed up as concern. It was a line, plain and unmoving. Evelyn looked at the elevator bank, then at the sea of strangers pretending not to stare at the child in the middle of their corporate collapse. She made a choice. "He comes with us," she said. The private elevator opened with a soft chime. Upstairs, the boardroom was too cold, its long walnut table scattered with binders, sweating water glasses, and half-open laptops throwing sterile light across anxious faces. Charles Mercer was already there in person, which meant he had wanted the optics of a rescue before lunch. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and said, "This is highly irregular." Daniel set Owen in the leather chair nearest the wall, crouched to eye level, handed him a tablet and headphones, and only then turned around. "So is engineering a panic to steal a company," he said. Charles smiled, but only with his mouth. "You are not part of this governance structure." "That's where you're wrong," Evelyn said before Daniel could answer. She moved to the head of the table, dropped her phone beside the agenda, and authorized a formal internal investigation in front of everyone. Gasps were small, but audible. A pen rolled across polished wood. One vice president stood up and announced he was resigning effective immediately. Another refused to certify the morning's financial guidance. Control was no longer slipping. It was breaking in chunks. Charles seized the opening and called for the noon vote to proceed at once. Hands began to move. Not all of them, but enough to smell danger in the room like overheated wiring. Daniel had been quiet for nearly a minute, quiet enough that Charles mistook it for powerlessness. Then he stepped toward the end of the table and made one phone call. No speech, no display, just a name, a time, and 4 words spoken into a dead-still room. "Release the hold now." 10 seconds later, Evelyn's smaller phone vibrated. Then the deputy counsel's. Then Charles's. The lenders had reversed their freeze request. The supplier halt was lifted. A major institutional shareholder had submitted a statement opposing any forced removal before a forensic review. Around the table, posture changed first, then tone. The same people who had leaned toward Charles now leaned back from him, as if the air around his chair had gone hot. Evelyn looked from one face to the next, then at Daniel. He did not explain. He only reached for the pitcher of water, poured a glass, and set it near her hand as though stabilizing a collapsing empire was no louder than setting a table. Charles's jaw tightened. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. The elevator chimed behind them. The boardroom doors opened. 3 men in dark suits entered with the unhurried stillness of people who never needed to raise their voices to be obeyed, and the oldest among them looked directly at Daniel before speaking into the silence. "Sir," he said, "the rest of your instructions are ready." The air changed before anyone moved. Cool recycled ventilation hummed above the polished walnut table, and the soft click of Italian leather shoes on stone seemed louder than Charles Mercer's breathing. The 3 men who entered carried the faint scent of winter cologne and rain from the lobby, but what settled over the room was older than perfume and heavier than weather: recognition. Daniel did not rise quickly or theatrically. He only turned his head, one hand still resting near Owen's small shoulder, and gave the slightest nod. "Thank you, Victor," he said. "Begin with the debt calls." The oldest man opened a black portfolio with the crisp sound of expensive paper. Another placed a thin silver tablet on the table and rotated it toward Daniel, not toward Evelyn, not toward the board. Charles stared as if the floor had shifted under him by an inch, and then another. "You knew them," Evelyn said, her voice even, though her fingers had gone still on the back of the chair. Daniel glanced at her, not defensive, not apologetic, just quiet in that unsettling way of his. "I know the people who matter when institutions forget how to behave." Victor tapped the screen. Numbers glowed against the glass, lender positions reversing in real time, bridge financing reinstated, margin pressure evaporating like steam off asphalt after rain. Around the table, directors who had spoken over Evelyn an hour earlier leaned forward without realizing it. Their watches flashed beneath the white boardroom light. Their mouths stayed shut. Daniel stepped closer to the screen and spoke in the same tone he used at breakfast, the same tone that had once asked Owen whether he wanted syrup or jam. Mercer's group used 3 shell vehicles to force a panic sale. The leak softened valuation. The lender scare was meant to corner the board before noon. It would have worked if they were dealing with frightened people instead of impatient ones. Charles slammed a palm on the table. The crack bounced off the glass wall. "This is impossible." "No," Daniel said. "It was just expensive." Evelyn's gaze cut to him, then to Victor, then to the signatures rolling in on the tablet one after another. A Midwest pension fund. A sovereign office in Singapore. A private banking consortium she had spent years trying to meet through assistants and gatekeepers. Every confirmation came to Daniel first. Every man on the screen addressed him with brief, unshowy respect. Not sir in flattery, sir in alignment. Owen looked up at his father with the calm of a child who had seen this steadiness before, though not in a room lined with market screens and enemies in tailored suits. "Dad," he said softly, "are we staying?" Daniel's hand brushed the back of the boy's hair. "For a little longer." The tenderness of that answer in the middle of a corporate collapse struck Evelyn harder than the data. She moved at last, circling the table until she stood beside Daniel instead of across from him. "Why were you on that list?" she asked. Charles made a choking sound. "You can't be serious." She did not look at Charles. Daniel did not answer immediately. Outside the glass, phones rang in sharp little bursts. Printers spat warm paper, and somewhere down the hall a cart will squeaked over grout. He lifted the tablet, studied the final authorization, then set it down in front of her. At the bottom of the page was not a bank logo but the parent authority above all of them, the controlling signature behind the rescue, the name hidden behind layered trusts and acquisitions that had quietly touched nearly every balance sheet in the room. Vale Meridian Holdings. Evelyn's eyes dropped to the authorizing line. D. Brooks. Not contractor. Not spouse. Executive chairman. Her wedding ring touched the glass with a tiny sound as her hand tightened. "You put yourself on the shortlist," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "I allowed it." Charles took one step back, then another. For the first time that morning, the room did not merely doubt him. It began to understand that the man they had mocked as convenient was standing at the center of the machinery they had mistaken for their own. And when Daniel turned fully toward Evelyn, the quiet in his face carried the weight of a door about to open. "If she wants the truth," he said to Victor, "bring the full file." A folder slid across the walnut table with the dry whisper of thick paper on polished wood. Outside the glass wall, the trading screens still flickered red and green, and the low electric buzz of a building under stress carried through the vents like distant insects. Victor set the file down in front of Evelyn with both hands, not ceremonially, simply carefully, as though what lay inside had weight beyond paper. Daniel did not touch it. He stood beside Owen, one palm loose at his side, jacket open, expression unreadable in the pale boardroom light. "Open it," Evelyn said. Her own voice came back to her from the glass, flatter than she intended. Inside were not rumors or flashy headlines. There were audited structures, trust maps, controlling interests, board appointments, private infrastructure holdings, and acquisition chains that ran beneath half the industries keeping the country upright. Shipping, energy storage, emergency credit, medical logistics, quiet ownership, layered and disciplined, all feeding upward into one name she had never seen printed on any billionaire ranking because it never needed the attention. Daniel Brooks. The room held still. Even the HVAC seemed to soften. Charles gave a breathless laugh that fooled no one. "A forged package changes nothing." Victor answered without heat. "The SEC filings are time-stamped. The Delaware records are certified. The Federal Reserve counterparties have already confirmed control positions." One director reached for the file, fingers trembling just enough to tap the paper. Another director pulled his hand back like the pages were hot. Evelyn kept turning sheets. The fine texture of heavy stock rasped against her fingertips. There were photographs, too, not glossy publicity images, but institutional ones. Daniel entering meetings through side doors, Daniel seated with heads of sovereign funds, Daniel standing beside leaders whose names moved markets with a sentence. No smile in any of them. No performance. Just the same quiet face that had packed Owen's lunch that morning. "Why hide this from me?" she asked. Daniel looked at her directly now. "Because everyone around you wanted a symbol they could manage," he said. "You did too at first." The truth landed cleanly because it was cruel enough to be honest. She remembered the courthouse, the contract, the cold terms, the way she had measured him by shoes, by silence, by what he did not flaunt. Owen climbed into one of the leather chairs and sat on his knees, small hands folded on the edge of the table, watching the adults with solemn patience. Daniel crossed the room at last and pressed a second document beside the first. This one was shorter. It named the shell companies Charles had used, the internal officers who had fed leak schedules, the compensation trails, the timed lender pressure, and the private messages already preserved by outside counsel. Noon vote is over, Daniel said. Security is removing Mercer's access now. The regulators will have the rest in 12 minutes. Right on cue, the boardroom doors opened again. Badges clicked. 2 internal security leads entered with 1 member of outside counsel, and the sound of Charles's chair scraping backward cut hard across the silence. You can't do this, Charles snapped, but no one rose with him. No one echoed him. The directors who had spent the morning circling Evelyn now looked at Daniel first, and then at the file, as if realizing they had mistaken a mountain for fog. Evelyn stood. The movement was small, but it changed the room. She placed one hand over the evidence packet and the other on the back of Daniel's chair, claiming both truth and alliance in the same breath. You wanted a vote, she said to Charles, her tone cool as glass. Here it is. Remove him. Remove every director tied to him. Reinstate my authority in full. Hands lifted one by one. Some quickly, some with shame. All of them counted. Charles stood alone in the bright boardroom, face drained of color, while outside the windows a bank of news cameras flashed far below like heat lightning. Then Evelyn turned to Daniel, the file still open between them, and asked the question that silenced even the lawyers. How much of this world answers when you speak? Daniel met her gaze without blinking. Enough, he said, to save your company by noon. Then he slid the final page toward her, and at the bottom, beneath the controlling entities and signatures, was the net worth estimate no publication had ever printed, a number so far beyond celebrity wealth and public rankings that the board forgot to breathe, because the poor single father they had tried to use had just become, in one cold page and one quiet sentence, the richest man any of them had ever imagined. The overhead lights hummed with that sterile blue-white glare that made expensive wood look colder than steel, and somewhere beyond the glass, camera shutters kept cracking like distant ice. A faint scent of burnt coffee and printer toner hung in the boardroom air. Nobody at the table reached for the documents anymore. Nobody argued. Evelyn stood with one hand braced against the walnut edge, her wedding ring catching the light in a tiny hard flash, while Daniel remained seated beside Owen as if the room had not just learned it had been orbiting him all along. Charles Mercer's face had gone the color of old paper. Security waited near the door, still and watchful, after Victor's final file had ended his authority for good. Then Evelyn moved. She gathered the stack of control papers with careful fingers, squared them once against the table, and set them down in front of Daniel instead of in front of herself. It was a small motion, quiet as breath, but every person in that room understood what it meant. You could have taken everything from me on day one, she said, her voice low enough that the microphones outside could never steal it. The company, the board, my name. Why didn't you? Daniel looked at her for a moment, then at the boy beside him, whose sneakers tapped softly against the chair rung before going still. Because control was never the point, he said. Protection was. The answer landed with more weight than the net worth figure had. Evelyn's chin tightened. The cold authority she had worn for weeks did not shatter all at once. It came off piece by piece, like glass unfastening from a window after a storm. She turned to the remaining directors, the ones who had pushed her into a marriage they thought would make her manageable, and the air changed before she even spoke. Record this vote, she said. Charles Mercer is permanently removed. All coercive marriage-linked governance conditions are void. Every emergency clause used to corner this company into blackmail dies today. A few tried to object. Victor cut them off with one glance and a soft slide of his pen across the legal pad. The motion was almost polite. The silence after it was absolute. Evelyn signed first. Daniel did not reach for the page until she looked directly at him. Not the richest man in the room now. Not the savior of her company. Just the husband she had treated like a liability, and the father whose son had learned too early how to stay quiet in grown-up storms. Owen looked up at her. Are we still going home with you? He asked. That question, small and plain and terribly honest, did what the boardroom battle could not. Evelyn bent to his height, the wool of her coat brushing the chair, the cool scent of rain from outside still clinging to the hem. Only if you want to, she said. Owen nodded once, certain in the simple way children can be when adults finally stop pretending. Daniel rose then, slow and composed, but there was caution in him now, not power. He had crushed lenders, broken a takeover, and silenced a room full of predators, yet this was the one ground he did not force. If you want out, he told her, I'll sign whatever frees you. The company will stay protected. So will you. So will he. Evelyn's hand closed over the papers before he could pull them away. The stock was thick and smooth beneath her palm. No, she said. Not because you saved my company. Not because of what you own. Her breath caught once, then steadied. Because when you had every reason to rule my life, you chose restraint. Because my house felt less empty when your son laughed in it. Because the only man in this city strong enough to control everything was the one man decent enough not to. Daniel searched her face as if testing whether grace could be trusted when it arrived this late. Then she did the one thing nobody in that room had the courage to predict. She took off the temporary separation draft the attorneys had prepared, tore it clean through the signature line, and let the pieces fall across the polished table like pale winter leaves. Outside, the press kept roaring. Inside, the board kept staring. But Owen grinned, slid his small hand into Evelyn's, and Daniel's guarded stillness finally gave way to something warmer, something human, something earned. By the time they walked out together, the richest man alive was no longer the miracle in that building, because the greater wonder was that the woman forced to marry him had chosen, at last, and without force, to become his wife.